we discuss the theoretical foundations of the corporate governance course and of the corporate governance debate. And I started out by showing you that there's three types of research in this area. One is a research of the nature of a descriptive theory, which explains the law as it is and therefore and condenses it into a simplified explanation. So that's a sort of it sort of surveys what's out there and then creates explanations of why the law is as it is. The next type of contribution is normative. So there are normative theories and they make recommendations. So they usually start out with looking at the way how things are at the moment and then go on and develop recommendations from some theoretical basis to say what should change. And then there's empirical research, and that is looking at the reality. And empirical research tests the theories, and also there you get questions like, for example, noise in data. So you use empirical methodology to survey reality and need to take a view on what are the data points? Is there noise in them? How many data points do you need to create to draw reliable conclusions? So that's sort of here you see the various contributions that people make in their work. So what is theory useful for? Well, depending on what your outlook is, you could formulate, for example, a normative theory making a recommendation as to who should appoint managers and who should remove them. Or you can formulate a positive theory explaining why managers are appointed by shareholders and why they're removed by them. Another area where theoretical analysis contributes is, for example, content of directors' duties. Are directors required to work in the interests of shareholders? Are they required to work in the interest of creditors? Do they have responsibilities towards the government? And why is that? And should we make normative recommendations recommending a change to that? Another question is who drafts the Constitution? Can or should the Constitution override the Companies Act? Can it be amended? And how much mandatory law should there be? And your perception of what the role of company law is would affect your decision, your answers to all of those questions. So if you say company law is there basically for shareholders, it's a mechanism for shareholders to maximize their wealth, then you arrive at the conclusion they obviously draft the Constitution. They can override the Companies Act. It can be amended by them, and there should be very little mandatory law. Now, this is sort of to put on the table a very old theory, concession theory. And it's old because companies used to be, when they were first created, an extension of the involvement of the state in the economy. So the idea was they're available on an ad hoc basis, and you need to apply either to the Crown or to Parliament to get special permission to have a company incorporated. That ended in 1844 when companies became generally available. All you had to do was follow the procedure set out in the Companies Act. And once you did that, you register your company. Companies are therefore tools for economic activity. And so their role has shifted. They've become a means of private activity. More so than they were. And The question then is also, however, to what extent are they an instrument of public policy? So there is a sort of debate here: is company law a branch of public policy, and to what extent is it? Or is company law a tool for private contracting, and to what extent is that? Is it that? I think you can also sort of connect concession theory to legal positivism, and that's also then my next slide, because there is a theoretical contribution by Hart, and he says it's not helpful to have an external framework. All we need to do is read the statutes and the cases. So I sort of put his view here as a question. The question to ask, therefore, is it helpful to have an external framework? If you take a legally positivistic framework, you're in good company. Not only would you follow Hart, there's also some case law that supports an approach rooted in legal positivism. So the famous Salomon case says companies are an artificial thing, have an artificial existence, and we need to understand the law on its own terms. In Meridian and Global Funds, a much more recent but very important case, there is the statement that there's no such thing as the company as such, no Ding an sich, there are only applicable rules. And the Ding an sich point is, of course, a reference to the German phrase, the thing as such. The conclusion of that case is anthropomorphism doesn't help. The idea is conceiving companies as something similar to human beings isn't a helpful exercise. Then there is the Bank of Tokyo case, another case that sort of expresses a view that economic analysis isn't helpful. And the statement there is, we're not concerned with economics, but with the law. And this distinction between the two is in law fundamental. So we've got, Mr. Comma there, we've got some statements here that show us that the judiciary, the judges, the common law, is generally not interested in engaging in a theoretical discussion. So legal positivism has no external framework. The idea is the state sets the framework, and whose interests are protected is a matter of policy choice. There are no normative recommendations. There are no positive explanations either. And yes, you can criticize doctrinal lawyers as creating some boring empty towers of legal construct with nothing but wind. But there is some benefit, in my view, in understanding the law in its own right, because it's only after that you're able to make observations about explaining it and also make observations about reforming it. Now then, let's move on to the sort of current mainstream theoretical discussion. It is inspired by a Nobel Prize winning contribution by Coase. And his question was, why are there firms? And his answer was, firms exist because they minimize transaction cost. So he says, economic interaction either occurs in a market where people meet ad hoc, buy and sell, and when they need more, they come back and do more buying, or when they have made more products, they go to the market again and do more selling. And then he says, well, sometimes there's a cost associated with that, and that cost is minimized when production is organized through a hierarchy. So you form a relationship with other people and sort of exchange in the context of that. And for some activity, that's efficient. Some activities are efficient to carry out through a hierarchical corporate framework. And so that's sort of an explanation as why we have markets and why we have firms, and why sometimes exchanges are organized ad hoc and other times they're organized in the context of a firm. And there's a normative recommendation that connects to that, and that recommendation is let the market operate. So economic analysis is connected with sort of the neoliberalism that became very prominent in the 1980s. The assumption is that people are rational actors, and a sort of later stage development of it and are formal mathematical models. So these are ways of analyzing interactions using mathematical models. In the context of our field, there are some of those, but they're much more frequently intuitive models. So this is not like formalized explanation of what we think is going on, rather much more sort of an explanation of logical connections. But definitely, and the analysis, the core of the analysis is an incentive-based analysis. So we look at what are the incentive of directors, what are the incentives of shareholders, and make recommendations based on that, or explain the law based on the incentives that we observe. And then there is another relatively new but now well-established field in behavioral analysis, and that softens the assumption of rational actors and introduces the idea that people act sometimes rationally, but sometimes they don't. And when they don't, in what way do they act? And how does that affect corporate governance? And that analysis is very strongly focused on empirical work. So it's a branch of analysis that connects economics to psychology. Now, the sort of following from Coase's contribution, then there developed an idea of analyzing corporate law as contract law, or rather connecting it to contract law. So the idea is companies are a nexus of contracts, and they are a legal fiction which serve as a hub for contracting. And that puts private action at the center and reserves a very small role for the government and its legislative intervention. So contractarian contributors make the following positive observations. They say the rules that we have mimic what the market would do, and they also are rules, as far as they're mandatory, that we need because of a market failure. They make normative recommendations, and those are that outcomes are best if we let the market operate. Disclosure is very, very important because it informs the market, allowing participants to make better decisions. And Milton Friedman has articulated this idea of let the market operate in his very famous statement where he says the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. There's also a famous quote from Adam Smith where he says, "I've never known much good done by those who affected to trade in the public good." So the idea the idea is the market operates and we will be all better off we all will be better off when we each individually maximize the returns for ourselves. So in contractarian approaches, shareholders aren't owners because from a legal sense, the companies are the owners. they are perceived as what is called residual claimants, meaning that their return is prioritized, or rather ranks after, is subordinated to everyone else's claim in a winding up, but also through the profit calculation rules. So shareholders get paid last because profit can only be paid once creditors have been looked after. And in a winding up, also shareholders get paid last. Then the sort of the idea is, and the idea of incomplete contracts, where also in some ways going back to codes, where so organizing activity through a company makes it sort of, because we're organizing future activity, we cannot foresee all eventualities, so we create hierarchical structures where decision making is allocated between participants to accommodate the uncertainty of the future. And also another important fact to take into account in terms of portfolio is portfolio theory, meaning that investors are well able to protect themselves against negative outcomes by structuring their portfolios, by diversifying their investments. Now, connected to contractarian theories is the agency cost analysis, and that is the mainstream, modern, you can say orthodox theoretical approach. How does it work? You analyze company law in terms of its participants, and you say the welfare of one person depends on the decisions made by someone else. That's an agency relationship. And the directors are the agents of shareholders in that analysis. You can see that the company is left out of this analysis. We sort of say what company law deals with is an agency situation where the well-being of the shareholders is affected by the decisions of the directors. And because directors and shareholder interests aren't aligned, cost arises. And that cost is the cost of monitoring. Then things called bonding expenses. So that's what the monies directors spend on things that impress shareholders. So one sort of banal example would be high glossy brochures explaining how very well the directors have done. And then less benign are things like fraud or shirking, so not sort of just seeming to work hard rather than actually doing work, and enrichment more generally. So these are then agency cost, these are examples of agency cost. Agency cost analysis, because it has this assumption that there's this conflict of interest, says the cost of that conflict of interest would be reduced if we aligned interests better. So the idea is executive pay is an important tool aligning those interests. And we will see later that there is problems associated with this assumption. The next one, so then there's the observation that the market mitigates agency costs. So product markets, consumers keep directors or sort of keep directors under control, exercise pressure on directors, lenders exercise pressure on directors, and directors are also subject to a market for executive labor, meaning they're hoping to impress that market. And then another one, also a very important one that has a very prominent role, and also originates from the 1980s, is this idea of the market for corporate control, meaning that, and that was a very acute observation at the time when that argument was articulated, that directors don't like takeovers because they mean that they are very likely going to lose their job. And when the argument was formulated, there was a very, very active market for takeovers. So there was a lot of takeover activity. And so the idea is of that argument that the directors wanting to prevent a takeover preemptively do a good job, because they fear that if they become, they're viewed as sort of not delivering enough for their shareholders, there will be a takeover and they will be removed. And then there is the enlightened shareholder model, which is what the current Companies Act in the UK has adopted, and that's the idea that it is probably wrong to view company law as a battleground of the various constituencies. In many, many ways, the interests of the participants overlap. So directors, when they will do well when the shareholders will do well. But also, neither directors nor shareholders can do well if they have an unmotivated workforce, because then they can't produce what they would like to do. So there's an area of overlap where the interests of the various participants are similar, or rather where creating a conflict is in the interest of no one. So that's sort of that. There's various expressions of these contractarian models, and they are set out in the reading, so I won't go into them here. A critique of that approach is it's wrong at a positive level because it ignores the existence of the company. It's also wrong at an empirical level, and there is in your reading an overview article that sort of says people have tried to look for this market, but there's, for example, no charter competition. So it's not the case that different shareholders or different companies adopt different models. And another way of critiquing this approach is that executive remuneration has been a main recommendation by the proponents of agency theory, and it hasn't worked. So we've got very serious problems with executive remuneration. And then that's a question that I'm looking at the moment in my research, and that is, how far does the idea that companies are organizations take us? Is it right to say that companies, so that's a focus away from the participants and their incentives, but a focus on the company as an organization, and so the companies as autonomous actors, and the idea is that they are more than just a sort of aggregation of the contribution. So there is some psychology that happens when people work together, and company law tries to address and work with that psychology. And then so you see this in the context of the liability for tort and crime, where we're now seeing a modern model of holding companies liable criminally, but also holding them liable for their organizational failure to prevent crime. Real entity theory contains an empirical claim, and the claim is it actually the case that you can show that companies, there's an autonomous element to them, which I think the empirical literature has shown. So here is sort of the sort of sociology and psychological literature that I rely on for that empirical claim. There's there are different ways of acting. One is traditional action, one is rational action, and then there's routine action. Traditional action would be an example of certain religious practices that made sense in a certain climate and have now become the expression of religious or traditional feelings. Rational action is what economists assume in neoclassical theory, how people act. And then there's routine action, so that's action that is people have learned and just repeat. And then there's something called administrative behavior. So when we form part of an organization, our behavior is shaped by the way people work around us. And when people work together, they develop formal and informal procedures to interact with each other. But those procedures take on a life of their own and become something that people learn when they join the organization, don't question at that point, and that is constantly shaped but has its own existence, which then leads me to conclude that organizations are autonomous in their own right. And imprinting is the word for the idea that you join the organization and it becomes, and it imposes on you a behavioral framework that you adopt. So that's sort of the idea that in reality, there's something of an organization that is autonomous and independent of its participants. So real entity theory from a legal perspective then, what's the role of the law? And the role of the law, in my view, is, yes, to work with incentives, but also to shape that organizational framework. And that's a move away from individual participants to looking at what kind of framework is there and how do the participants interact. So the law formalizes organizations, and the legislator makes assumptions in setting the framework about this real life phenomenon of organizational behavior. And definitely the common law has evolved around this real life phenomenon.